Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm here today with Mike Halloran of Mercer, Blair Jones of Semler Brossy, and Steve Harris from Fred Cook, and we're talking about executive compensation. Blair, can you start off by talking a little bit about some of the key influences affecting executive pay design these days?
You know, it's interesting. Say on Pay has been the primary influence that we've all had to be accountable to over the last few years, and I think the influence of activism has really accelerated the interest and the energy around a lot of the issues that Say on Pay started the dialogue around. Some of the other things that seem to be coming into play are income inequality as we think about the election cycle and the dialogue that's going on there. It's unclear what that is going to do for the dialogue around executive pay, but it's very clear that it's going to have some impact. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to need to watch.
You know, I would add a continuing influence is just the M&A activity. Companies are reshaping themselves and the like, and so that tends to contribute to changes in programs and then looking at what activists think who are part of the M&A trend as well. So I'd say that's another influence.
I would finish off that with a couple of things. One, the institutional side is really behaving in a different manner toward organizations today. They're not just looking at whether the share price is going up, and they're not really so much focused on the how much of executive pay, but they're more and more focused on what is being measured to determine executive pay and what level of performance is determining the pay. And then I would add a last element, which is the regulatory environment. It is choking organizations in the financial service arena, small businesses, and I think it's getting worse month by month.
So we see scrutiny and guidance coming from a lot of different places. Does everyone want the same thing, or are there conflicts depending on where it's coming from?
Well, it seems like there are two things that the bodies are focusing on. One is pay for performance, and I think everybody agrees that that's the objective we have. And then the other question seems to be how much is too much or how much is enough. But when you dig beneath the policies that the different organizations have, that's where the divergence happens. So Steve was talking about the institutions, and one of the challenges you have there is you talk to one institution and their guidance around measures may be one thing, it may be relative TSR, and you talk to another institution and they want you to measure your operational goals and how you're doing against that, and trying to sort out what is the most important thing when you're getting different input, and then of course the regulatory input is different from that. It's very, very challenging for companies.
We hear from many companies, what do we do when you get this mixed input? And I think many are falling back to, we've heard the input, what are we trying to do as a company, and how can we perhaps set the ship in the right place and try to meet many but not all the things we've heard, and then communicate how we've landed in terms of our answer. But you won't make everyone happy for sure. There
are a lot of conflicts that exist, and probably none more apparent than the conflict between the regulators on the financial side and ISS, for instance. And the regulators, they're very interested in certain provisions that align with Dodd-Frank and what they believe is right. ISS takes a very different view, and financial institutions need to follow what the regulators want because the penalty is far worse. But what I tell organizations is, do what's right for the business whenever in doubt. Start with the business and do what is right for the business and the shareholders and the employees and the customers, and I think that's a good path.
So are there any specific impacts on executive pay design?
The challenge that Steve is underscoring is there's all this pressure to do the same thing and to have a checklist of what's acceptable, whether it's having more than 50% performance-based pay, perhaps incorporating relative TSR in your program, making sure that you have stock ownership guidelines and a clawback policy that fit certain parameters. And what you need to do, though, however, that's the pressure, but that takes away from what exec pay is all about, which is about helping you align your people around your business strategy and reinforcing the key messages around that. So there's a tension for companies as they're being pulled to this converged answer to actually stay true to themselves and actually use compensation as a strategic tool.
Yeah, Blair, this is something that, as you both know, I've been fairly passionate about, is the homogenization of executive pay. And I think it's happened. I think we do see a lot of sameness, but I'm encouraged. I'm seeing more and more board members and management teams really try to strike out in certain ways to align with their business and to do things that are different. There aren't maybe as many examples as I would like to see of that, but there are more and more, and I encourage that. I think we're going to see that grow.
And the tension gets wrapped up a bit because many strong performing companies will always have a hiccup, and the year they have a hiccup, then the outsiders come at you saying you must be doing things all wrong. And to try to resist that urge, sometimes things happen in your business and you just need to keep going forward, but that's really the challenge sometimes, to not respond to the first bad year and feel you have to rejuggle the whole program.
Right, and some of that probably gets to how you're able to communicate your program externally to your shareholders and why you're doing it the way you are doing it. And I'm not sure clients and companies have perfected that art yet. I know they know why they've done what they've done, but getting the outside world to understand that and understand why you might go against the conventional wisdom is difficult.
If we segment companies that have a better chance of striking out and being different, and not falling into the trap of sameness or whatever, really there's a category that is most difficult, and that's the underperformers. If your TSR, total shareholder return, is very low on a relative basis, it's difficult to be very different. However, if you are a high-performing company or you're improving in your performance, there's a great opportunity there for organizations to do things that are different, that again fit their business case, that really help to message their strategy and reward execution on their strategy.
So there's about a 5-year history with Say on Pay since those first votes. Is it having the impact that was expected? If you look back 5 years and kind of think about where we are today and then going forward, what do you anticipate?
Well, I think that the answer is yes, there are many good things that have come out of it. I mean, the primary one, that it started a dialogue between companies and investors about executive pay, and that's all to the good. That's all to the good. And it has reined in a lot of the abuses out there. Those were related to certain perquisites and certain outsized things that companies were doing. All of that has gone away. But the negative of it is what we've been talking about here, that it's caused companies to feel like there's a formula, and that there's a check-the-box answer is a little bit disturbing and unfortunate.
Steve's point about the homogenization of programs is clearly a byproduct of Say on Pay. But then, the pushback is what's right for us, and how far off is it from being homogenized, and which path do you take? The strong performers can take their path a little more confidently than the weak performers who've had a short point, in which case then they're kind of stuck with a lot of pressure to do what others are doing.
So we're waiting on a few provisions from Dodd-Frank. How are boards responding to some of these anticipated changes?
Well, first of all, let's be clear that rules writing on the items that have not yet seen the rules written is some distance off. We do not have a quorum with the commission. We're in an election period. I really don't see personally anything coming out until perhaps the 2018 proxy. So we're some distance away from that. But I think the overwhelming sentiment is, and this is unfortunate, that the rules, when they're written, however they're written, are not going to be helpful. In other words, they're not going to be beneficial to shareholders, to give them better understanding of what's going on in compensation programs. They're not going to be really very helpful in terms of governance of organizations. They're going to lead to much longer disclosure, which is already very confusing for all but the most sophisticated investor. So, while I think there will be some benefits, certainly, I think the overarching sentiment that I hear is one that, here we go again. We're going to go deeper down the rabbit hole.
Is there anything organizations can do about that? Can they get involved? Is there something they should be doing inside their own organizations to kind of prepare for what you anticipate is coming that may or may not be fruitful, but it's coming?
Well, I suppose you could vote a certain way at the polls, and that might be helpful. But short of that, it's candidly very difficult to push back on these provisions of Dodd-Frank. I mean, I would just say that I think this is typical legislation process where it's a pendulum. And when there's a crisis, the pendulum moves, and it moves very far, too far to one direction, and it needs to shift back. And I think that's where we are. And we'll see what it takes to make that happen.
And the unfortunate thing is the amount of energy and time and cost that's gone into what it might be when we don't know is a complete waste of time. But nevertheless, companies have to spend some time doing this, which is unfortunate.
Right, and I think companies probably serve themselves well by doing dry runs now, and many companies have done that to see what it looks like. and maybe the constructive part of that is, particularly on the pay versus performance, which tends to provide some very unintended answers, to think about, well, how could we tell this story differently, and to get ahead of that. I think that helps the messages we were talking about with the outside investor groups, but it also makes you more prepared for something that you might be forced to do that is going to put you in a bad light, or put you in a confusing light is probably a better way to say it. I'm not sure it's necessarily a bad light. It's just it adds confusion to the story.
And I think a fairly prevalent view that I hear, at least, and I think it's fair, that the CEO pay ratio, and those rules are written, and pay for performance will likely be kind of punchlines for those who have an agenda. And I think there'll be an impact initially, but I think that will wane over a period of time. I think we'll get back to kind of business as usual. But again, my earlier point, I'm not sure that there'll be much real benefit from these rules.
In terms of influence from activist investors, do you anticipate any help there?
Activist investors are not all the same. Let me say that, first of all, very clearly. There are some activist investors, and I've had direct experience with them on boards, that are very well-informed, very well-meaning, focused on, I think, a balance of things, including share value growth. And I think they can be very helpful members of the board and very helpful investors. And then there are activist investors who are focused on one thing, and that's driving the share price growth and then getting out. And that's not very helpful. So I think it really depends on what activist investor you're talking about.
And the context of what's happening in the company, because where they come in and why they come in affects whether pay is part of the equation or not part of the equation.
But it's clearly part of the dynamic these days. For those who've been through the experience, they've lived it, and it's pay related. In some cases, it's unpay related in others. But those that haven't had the experience are now having to spend some time saying, what might we do? Where are we vulnerable? And should we be thinking about other things to do?
Well, and I think that's the important point there, because if an activist chooses to focus on your pay, it's as if it's say on pay on steroids, that all of the issues that come up on say on pay are just magnified. And they tend to focus on things about peer group and who you're comparing to. They focus on things about whether your pay and performance are aligned, and it's a very bad answer if pay's been going up and performance has been going down. And they look at all the little governance practices, and getting ahead of it, as Mike said, is a pretty good idea.
So continuing to look forward, what are your predictions for the future of executive pay design?
I really do think it depends in part on what kind of environment we have in Washington, and whether we have additional impetus to a heavy regulatory environment, or we have maybe a pulling back of that pendulum that I described earlier. I think based on the rhetoric in the election, and based on the reality, I mean, I think the average American has been squeezed, and I think they are clearly pushing back, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or independents. And I think that voice is going to be heard, and I think that's going to have an influence where the high highs of executive pay will not be as prevalent anymore. I think we need to focus on not equality in terms of wages or whatever, but just we need to watch out for what we're doing with executive pay, because we could get into a situation where it really does become a public issue in a big way that boomerangs against boards and companies in trying to field a competitive group and quality group of executives.
I'd also add, as Steve mentioned earlier, the SEC is pretty much kind of hamstrung, not having a majority to take any action. Many in the corporate world would love them to take more action on the proxy advisors, which hasn't happened and may not. They're starting to creep into areas where they don't have the expertise, but they clearly have the platform, criticizing companies' goal setting where they don't really have the ability to do it, but they have the platform to do it. I think that's going to be a challenge for many companies going forward.
And I think in terms of the future, we're going to see pendulum swinging, as Steve said, but on some of the things that we accept today is okay. I think that the experiment around performance-based plans has been mixed at best. People have questions about relative TSR. They have questions about whether you can really set goals for 3-year plans. Not every company's cycles align with a 3-year time period. So it feels like to me, as all of the 5 years of Dodd-Frank impact have happened and companies have adopted, well, not the same plan, more similar plans, people are going to evaluate their experiences, and companies may swing back. We may see some more of traditional vehicles like options. We're already seeing that at some companies. We may see more strategic goals come into the mix, and we may see new thinking around things like ownership guidelines.
To pick up on that, because I very much agree with that, I think the theme, to be very positive, and I think it is very positive, that we'll see going forward very, very likely is greater differentiation. Differentiation across individuals in terms of grants of long-term compensation as well as payment of bonuses, so forth. But importantly, differentiation across companies that are in different places in their business cycle, that their fact patterns are different. So stock options can be very helpful for a high-performing organization, or there are some ways of designing programs that are very highly levered, but driven off of what benefits shareholders, or TSR, and can generate some very strong rewards. And there's good cover to do that, and those monies are truly earned. So I think we'll see more differentiation rather than the sameness that we've kind of gotten ourselves into a box of. At least that's my hope.
The key I would just add would be patience, because we're in an arena now with activists and all of these things. You want to think long-term, you want to have a program that works long-term, but sometimes you don't have the ability to pull that out. You make a change and people aren't really going to give you the time to see if it does play out. And to Blair's point, setting 3- and 4-year goals is real tough. So then there's the pressure to set shorter goals, but then that's not long-term thinking. So the issue of patience is going to be, I think, one to look for.
Thank you all for taking a few minutes with us.
Thank you.
For World at Work TV, I'm Allison Avalos.